Hi there. Let's go ahead and head on into period 3, part 2. Now, if you would listen to the first video that I made for period 3, recognize that I talked about the basically 1754 till the early 1770s, going through the French and Indian War and then the taxations and the problems that had angered the colonists so much. In this period, I'll focus mainly on the American Revolution. So keep in mind, the ideas for the revolution were seated in the Enlightenment. Now, I had talked about the Enlightenment in period 2 content, and I referenced it as more the age of reason and scientific thinking versus religion. And now we have a development of Enlightenment, and you have a gentleman by the name of John Locke. And he had the idea and the belief that was spread that citizens actually have a right and an obligation to revolt against their leadership and their government if their government fails to protect them. And that means like their rights, their liberties, that type of idea. And this really resonated with the colonists. So looking at the beginning of the war itself and some of the things that occurred during this time period, we have the First Continental Congress. And the First Continental Congress is formed in Philadelphia in September of 1774. Now, not everyone was represented there. Georgia wasn't represented. And just realize that they were there in Philadelphia to determine how do we react to what is going on in the colonies and being done to us by the British. They basically were saying, how do we react to our rights and liberties being curtailed? There were splinters within the First Continental Congress between radical people like Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams, and then more moderates like George Washington, and then even more conservatives like John Jay. Realize, though, that in this group, there was not the loyalist perspective offered. Now, they did also do, they offered the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. And they sent this over to England, to the king, and basically said, let's right the wrongs of the past and move forward. And as a conciliatory note, they said that they would be willing, the colonists would be willing to recognize Parliament as parliamentary authority as the one who can actually regulate commerce and things like that. However, the king rejected it. And when the king rejected the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, the king also declared that the colony of Massachusetts in a state of open rebellion. And because of this rebellion, he could therefore move troops to that location. So this is what I think is kind of interesting. I forgot that part about Massachusetts being in that state of rebellion, because now it makes sense about the battles at Lexington and Concord. Now, the battles of Lexington and Concord are in April of 1775, and this is that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, one if by land, two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, that type of idea. Now, the British had specifically gone into Lexington and then to Concord to try to get the military supplies there. When they came across the American colonists, though, at Lexington, you have 5 Americans who were killed. And then at Concord, you have 250 British who were killed. The important point to note on that is, remember, after the French and Indian War, the American colonists had this sense of pride and unity in their military because they helped defeat the French, whereas the British were like, oh, you guys were a ragtag team. And it's like, look here at Concord, managed to get 250 British that were killed. Now, some other important parts of the battles of Lexington and Concord would also be that this is known as the shot heard around the world. And what that is referencing is all of these other empires and colonies that Europe had owned and controlled. they started to tune into this. Like, what is this nation, or what are these colonists doing against this big empire, the British Empire, and would they actually succeed? So then early on, you also have the Battle for Boston. And this is in June of 1775. And it's also known as Breeds and Bunker Hill. Now, the Battle for Boston would be considered a loss for the Americans. So I'll do American sad face. It would be considered a loss because the British did manage to capture Boston and the Americans, but it wasn't before the Americans had kind of dug in and actually inflicted heavy losses on the British as well. So in between, I guess you will, as far as Lexington and Boston, you have now a group, the Second Continental Congress. And the Second Continental Congress met in May of 1775, again in Philadelphia. And at the Second Continental Congress, this is where you get George Washington as Commander-in-Chief. And this is where you send, before he became a traitor, Benedict Arnold to Quebec. And the idea was to keep the Canadians away from supporting the British. And then you also have, they offered the Olive Branch Petition. So when you extend an olive branch, it means that you're trying to obtain peace, right? So in July of 1775, the colonists offered this one last ditch attempt to the King of England, and basically he threw it back in their face. So other influential people of the time period, and some documents to get us going here, is Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine, in January of 1776, wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. And Common Sense basically began to question, why should a king of this tiny island nation across this vast ocean rule a large continent? And why should the colonists pledge themselves to a corrupt form of government who didn't even listen to them? So it kind of goes along with some of those ideas from Locke and the Enlightenment theories here. So then we have the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence, obviously July 1776. It was written by Thomas Jefferson. And it was your list of grievances against the king. I should say also England. Now, this is the document that starts off by saying, like, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Okay? So the colonists now know that if they sign their name to this document, that there's no going back, that if they lose, they could actually be tried for treason. And so it ups the ante a bit, if you will. You have, then during the war, let's talk about who the fighters are. So you have the Patriots. And the Patriots are going to be the American colonists. And about a third of the people, of the colonists, joined in some way, shape, or form, whether it was actually as a soldier or helping supply the troops or anything along that way. About a third of the colonists joined. Then keep in mind that the Patriots were incredibly short on supplies, and that would include things like military equipment, food, bandages. I mean, basically soldiers were required to provide their own stuff. And at first they were incredibly short on supplies, the equipment, the food, that type of thing, and it was a huge disadvantage for them. For the Patriots, eventually African Americans did serve, and they totaled around 5,000 men. And now, the reason why the African Americans did not initially serve is because even if they were freemen, there was still question about it. Now, when the South offered their temptation to Southern African Americans that were slaves, basically said, hey, join our side and we will give you your freedom, that's when George Washington said, okay, let's allow African Americans to serve. So then on the opposite side, you have the Loyalists, also known as the Tories. The Loyalists were about 20 to 30% of total population. They tended to be wealthier and more conservative than the Patriots. Now, by the end of the war, okay, I should note, at end of war, about 80,000 fled to Canada. Now, the Loyalists either helped supply the food, the troops, that type of thing. They did fight alongside the British, like the Hessians. And then also they did also spy on the Patriots in their towns. Then lastly, let's talk about the Native Americans. The Native Americans really supported more so the British, especially at first, because the British promised that the colonies would not expand west. Which obviously was really ideal to the Native Americans. So talking about the actual, let's go through some more of the battles, the alliances, the victory, okay? Okay, so in 1775 to 1777, things were pretty bad for America. And that would include a disaster in New York City in 1776, where they completely lost control of that area. Also, this would include your Valley Forge area. So, at Valley Forge, which was the winter of 1777 to 1778, and this is where Washington basically camped with his troops and had help from Rochambeau for reteaching the troops how do you actually fight. They did smallpox inoculations. They figured out, hey, let's move the latrines from where we're cooking or where our drinking water is. Let's try to not have dysentery and all the sorts of other health problems. And after that winter at Valley Forge, we begin to see some changes for the soldiers themselves. Now, also, some problems that emerged during this time period would be economic problems. Staggering number for you, because the British closed the colony ports, 95% of their trade dropped. So they weren't getting the food, the equipment, that type of thing until the French get involved. So at the Battle of Saratoga, okay, the Battle at Saratoga is significant because this is when the French king, Louis XVI, okay, he ended up supporting the colonies. Now, with the support of the colonies, he had actually been sending over some money and military supplies starting in 1775, but his support wasn't outright. Now, in 1778, sorry, I should put that date for you, he does support them. Now, he doesn't support the idea of a revolution because he is a dictator. He is an absolute ruler, right, as a monarch in France. But he supports the idea of using the colonists to weaken the power of the British. And then within a year after the French openly support the Americans, the Spain and Holland join in too. So talking about the victory here and what leads us eventually to Yorktown In 1778 to 79, you have George Rogers Clark, and he wins in Illinois and Ohio for the colonists. Then in the 1780s, the British tried to go to the south, and they run into Nathanael Greene. And Nathanael Greene wins in the south, particularly against General Cornwallis because of guerrilla warfare. Then lastly, we have the battle at Yorktown. And this is the Yorktown in Virginia. This is in 1781. And this is where America defeats Cornwallis, and you have the French Navy on the Chesapeake side, obviously of the Atlantic Ocean, good job, and then the American troops by land. So what does the treaty look like? So the Treaty of Paris in 1783 is going to be with 4 big parts that the colonies and now the new nation wanted. They wanted the British to recognize the USA as an independent nation. They wanted Mississippi to be the definition of the Western Territory. And they wanted fishing rights off the Canadian coast. And then lastly, they agreed that the Americans would repay any sort of debt that they owed, particularly like to the loyalist and merchants and people along that line. So other things that I didn't really go into that just be aware of, like there is a battle at Trenton. There is like Benedict Arnold and how he eventually goes against the Americans. He becomes a traitor. So there are the Hessians fighting for the British. So there are some other elements that I didn't go fully into detail for you, but this gives you your rough idea of what happens during the Revolutionary War.